The auction yard smelled of whiskey and dust. Samuel Grady, a lonely rancher with more scars than smiles, watched as a drunk man shoved his trembling daughter onto the block. "She's deaf," the man slurred. "Ain't worth feedin'. But she can work." The crowd laughed. Samuel didn't. Something in the girl's eyes stopped him cold. Fear, yes, but also fire. He laid down his last $50. "I'll take her," he said. That night, as she scrubbed the floors of his quiet cabin, Samuel spoke softly, not expecting an answer. But when he dropped a bucket by accident, she flinched. He froze. Her secret was out. She wasn't deaf, and now he needed to know why she'd lied. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The clang of the metal bucket still rang in the air like a gunshot, the echo bouncing off the walls of the small cabin. And for a moment neither of them moved, just the sound of dripping water and the ragged tremor of her breath. Samuel Grady stood frozen by the doorway, his weathered hands still half raised as though to catch a ghost, his eyes locked on the girl kneeling in the spill. Lila. That was the name the auctioneer had barked out like a curse, the name he'd claimed for 50 hard-earned dollars and a sliver of conscience he hadn't expected to find again. She stared at the puddle spreading across the wooden floor, shoulders hunched, her thin frame shaking under the weight of something more than fear. Slowly, Samuel spoke, his voice rough as gravel but quiet, the way a man might speak to a skittish horse. "You can hear me, can't you?" The words came out more accusation than question. Lila's head jerked up, eyes wide, lips parting as though the truth itself might burn her tongue. For a long, terrible second she said nothing, and then she nodded once, small and quick, the movement of someone who'd spent too long expecting pain to follow honesty. Samuel's jaw tightened, his brow furrowing into deep, tired lines. "Then why lie?" he asked, and this time the softness fell away, replaced by the hard edge of a man who'd seen too much deceit in too many forms. Lila's lips quivered, her hands twisting the hem of her ragged skirt until the fabric nearly tore, but no sound came. The silence stretched thin, brittle, until it broke not with words, but with the sharp, helpless sob of a child who had run out of places to hide. She buried her face in her hands, the tears coming fast, shoulders shaking with the kind of grief that didn't belong to someone so young. "Please," she gasped between broken breaths. "Please. Don't send me back." The words hit him harder than any truth she could have confessed. Samuel took a slow breath, feeling the weight of every scar along his back, every ghost that had followed him out of war and wilderness alike. He hadn't meant to scare her hell. He hadn't meant to care at all. He'd bought her to keep her from the hands that would have used her worse, told himself it was pity or decency, not loneliness, not the echo of a life he'd once wanted but lost. But standing there, watching her fold in on herself like a cornered bird, he felt something twist deep inside anger. Not at her, but at the kind of world that made lies like hers necessary. He crouched down slow, the boards creaking under his boots, and reached out a calloused hand but stopped short of touching her. "Ain't no one sending you back," he said finally, his tone quiet again. Steady now, a promise more than comfort. "But I need to know the truth of it. You can't live here on false words." She peeked up through tear-blurred lashes, her lips trembling, and for the first time he saw the flicker of trust beneath the fear. Small, fragile, but real. Samuel straightened, sighing through his teeth, and fetched a rag to mop the spilled water. "You clean this up," he said softly, almost kindly. "Then we'll talk." And as he turned away, she whispered something so faint he almost missed it. "Thank you." Just 2 words, barely more than breath, but enough to make Samuel realize this lie of hers had been more than deceit, it had been survival. The lantern burned low, its light trembling against the cabin walls like a heartbeat that might give out any second, and in that dimness, the world seemed smaller, gentler, though the truth waiting between them was anything but. Samuel sat at the rough-hewn table, sleeves rolled, a chipped cup of coffee cooling in his hands, while Lila perched on the edge of the chair across from him, her fingers knotted tightly in her lap. Outside, the wind sighed through the pines, carrying the dry rasp of crickets, but inside, It was just the two of them, a broken man and a girl too young to have learned the language of lies so well. "You got something to say. Best say it now," he told her, not unkindly, but firm, his eyes fixed on the flame that flickered between them. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, in a voice small but clear, she began to speak. "My pa." She hesitated, swallowing hard. "He made me pretend. Said if folks thought I was deaf, they'd leave me be. He said it kept me safe." The words came haltingly, but once they started, they wouldn't stop. "Back where we lived, men drank, gambled, came by the house when he wasn't sober. He'd tell 'em I couldn't hear, couldn't talk, said I was touched in the head. They'd laugh, call him cursed, and leave. It worked. Till he ran out of money." Her eyes shimmered with the reflection of the lantern flame, her voice breaking at the edges. "He sold me, Mr. Grady. For whiskey. Said I was old enough to work off my worth. The man who bought me said I was lucky he liked quiet girls." The silence that followed hit like thunder. Samuel's jaw clenched so hard it hurt, his knuckles white around the coffee cup. He'd seen cruelty before, seen it in the eyes of soldiers, in the ruin of war and greed, but this was different, uglier because it was small and personal, and dressed in the face of a child. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words stuck in his throat. When he finally spoke, his voice came rough, quieter than he intended. "You're safe here, Lila. Ain't nobody gonna touch you or sell you or make you lie again. Not while I'm breathing." She looked at him, wide-eyed, searching for the trap she'd learned to expect, but there wasn't one. Just that worn, grizzled man who spoke like the truth cost him something each time he gave it. Slowly, she nodded, her shoulders loosening a little, though the fear didn't leave entirely. Samuel stood, poured what was left of the coffee into the sink, and busied himself with the fire, his movements stiff, deliberate. He didn't know how to comfort her, hadn't known how to live beside anyone since the day his own family was buried beneath a fever he couldn't stop. The idea of another soul in the cabin felt strange, like wearing a coat that didn't yet fit. Still, as he doused the lantern and the darkness swallowed them both, he found himself saying, almost to the shadows, "You did what you had to, girl. That don't make you wicked." In the faint moonlight slipping through the window, he saw her eyes close, the corners of her mouth trembling in something that wasn't quite a smile but was close enough. And though Samuel Grady didn't know how to share his life again, for the first time in years, he didn't feel completely alone in it. Morning came slow and gold across the valley, spilling through the thin curtains and cutting through the dust that always hung in the cabin air. And for the first time in what felt like years, Samuel Grady woke to something other than the sound of his own breath. Outside, a broom scraped against the porch, a bucket clattered, and somewhere beyond that, a young girl's quiet determination filled the silence that had once been his only companion. Lila had risen before him again, she always did. Now her small frame moving like a whisper through the chores, sleeves rolled high, hair tied back with a piece of twine. She cleaned the floors until they shone, swept out the stalls, gathered eggs, even managed to patch the old fence with strips of wire that had been rusting behind the shed since before she was born. Samuel watched from the porch, pipe forgotten in his hand, the faintest ghost of a smile creasing his worn face. The ranch had always been quiet, the kind of quiet that men who'd lost too much wrapped around themselves like a shield, but that quiet had changed. It no longer felt hollow. It breathed now. He found himself noticing things he'd long stopped seeing, the way the chickens scattered when she clapped her hands, the scent of bread baking where once the stove had stayed cold, the lightness that came from another pair of footsteps crossing the yard. He told himself it was strange, how quickly a place could come alive again, how the creak of the porch boards under her weight didn't grate on his nerves but steadied them instead. She never spoke much, not unless he asked, but she worked with a kind of grace that made him wonder what she might have been if the world hadn't ground her down so young. And then there was the humming. It started one evening near sundown, after the day's work was done. Samuel was mending a saddle by the fire when he heard it faint at first, carried on the wind through the open door. A soft tune, halting and unsure, like a bird that had forgotten how to sing. He set the leather aside and stepped onto the porch. There she was, hanging laundry in the fading light, her fingers red from the chill, her lips moving to a melody that didn't belong to any hymn he knew. The sound was fragile, cracked around the edges, yet it filled the air in a way that made his throat tighten. For so long, this place had been nothing but ghosts, the echo of his wife's laughter, the memory of a child's voice long gone, and now, somehow, this girl's broken humming was chasing them away, note by trembling note. She noticed him then, halfway through a line, and froze, the song dying on her lips. For a heartbeat they just stood there, the air heavy between them, until Samuel nodded once, quiet approval in his eyes. "Don't stop on my account," he said, voice gruff but gentle. Lila looked down, a flush rising to her cheeks, then gave a small, uncertain smile, the first he'd seen from her before turning back to the laundry. As he watched her pin the last shirt to the line, the breeze lifting it like a flag of truce, Samuel realized the silence he'd once guarded so fiercely wasn't gone at all. It had simply changed its shape, softened into something warmer, something alive. And for the first time in years, he didn't dread the coming of night. The ride into town felt longer than usual, though the trail hadn't changed. Same dry ruts carved by years of wagon wheels, same scrub and sage stretching endless under a hard blue sky. But Samuel felt the weight of eyes on him long before he reached Main Street. The townsfolk had a way of watching a man too long when they thought they knew something they shouldn't. And in a place like Dry Creek, secrets were rarer than rain. He hitched his horse outside the general store, boots crunching on the dusty boards, and stepped inside to the usual rattle of the doorbell and smell of tobacco and flour. The storekeeper, a wiry man named Grant McHale, looked up from behind the counter, his gaze sharp beneath the brim of his hat. "Morning, Grady," he said, drawing the word out slow. "Heard you picked up some help out at the ranch." Samuel nodded once, keeping his tone flat. "Needed an extra pair of hands." McHale leaned his elbows on the counter, the ghost of a smirk playing on his lips. "That the deaf girl from Johnson's place? Folks been talkin'." The words landed heavy, slick with meaning. Samuel set his jaw, the muscle in his cheek twitching as he stacked his supplies, coffee, nails, kerosene with deliberate care. "Can't say what she is to them," he said finally, his voice low and calm. "But to me, she's helping keep the place running." McHale chuckled. "That knowing sound men make when they think decency's just another kind of lie." "Sure she is," he muttered. Behind him, a couple of ranch hands sorting grain barrels snickered, one whispering something that made the other laugh outright. Samuel turned then, slow but dangerous, his eyes hard as flint. The laughter died in the space between heartbeats. "You boys got something to say?" he asked, his voice soft as dust but carrying the promise of violence. They dropped their eyes quick, mumbling excuses. He paid his bill in silence, the coins clinking like gunfire, and left without another word. Outside, the air felt tighter somehow, the stairs following him all the way to his horse. By the time he rode home, the sun was sinking low, painting the land in long, bleeding shadows. He found Lila out by the fence, mending a broken post with twine and nails she'd scrounged from the barn. She looked up when she heard the hoofbeats, her expression brightening a little, though the weariness never quite left her eyes. Samuel dismounted, setting down the sack of supplies, and after a long pause said, "Town's startin' to talk." She tilted her head, waiting. "About you," he added, his voice rough. "About us. They don't mean good by it." For a moment she just looked at him, unreadable, the wind tugging at her hair. Then she smiled small, faint, but real. "Folks round here talk too much," she said simply, wiping her hands on her skirt. "Then let's give 'em something worth talking about." The words caught him off guard, not boastful, not reckless, just quiet defiance, the kind that came from someone too tired to care what gossip could do anymore. Samuel stared at her a moment longer, then huffed out a breath that was half a laugh. "You're a handful, girl," he said, shaking his head. "Guess so," she replied, and went back to her work, humming under her breath. As the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in fire and gold, Samuel leaned against the fence, watching her, realizing that maybe, just maybe, what people thought didn't matter half as much as the strange, stubborn peace that had begun to grow between them, something worth talking about indeed. The morning was still and sharp, the kind that carried the smell of dry grass and the faint tang of rain somewhere far off, when Samuel Grady saw the figure at his fence line. At first he thought it was just a drifter, one of the usual desperate men cutting through to town. But as he drew closer, leading his mare from the barn, he recognized the slouch in the shoulders, the bottle in hand, the crooked swagger that spoke of rot long before a word was said. The man was leaning against a post, hat pulled low, his clothes stained with whiskey and dust, and even from a distance Samuel could smell the sourness of him. "Can I help you with something?" Samuel called, his voice even but carrying across the field like a drawn gun. The man straightened, grinning through broken teeth. "Reckon you can," he slurred. "Name's Johnson. I'm here for what's mine." The word struck cold. Samuel's gut tightened as he stepped closer, keeping the fence between them. "Ain't got nothing of yours here." Johnson's eyes gleamed, small and mean. "Oh, you got something all right, my girl. Deaf one. Sold her to that auction yard in town for a fair bit, and damned if I didn't find out she ended up here. Guess you bought her same as I sold her. So let's not play dumb, mister. She's mine by blood, and I've come to take her home." His voice cracked like a whip on that last word, the kind of word men use when they mean cage. Samuel didn't flinch. He planted his boots in the dirt, jaw tight, eyes colder than the steel of the rifle leaning by the porch. "She ain't yours," he said quietly, each word measured, deliberate. "Not anymore." Johnson's grin faltered, then curdled into something ugly. "You think you can just keep her? You think I won't be back with folks who know what's right?" He spat into the dust, eyes narrowing. "Ain't the law out here for men like me, but it don't stop us neither." Samuel stepped closer, his shadow crossing the fence, and for a moment their eyes locked, one man filled with fury, the other with something quieter but deadlier. "You come back," Samuel said, his voice low, steady, the voice of a man who'd seen too much to bluff. "And you'll find the ground here don't take kindly to trespassers. You understand me?" Johnson sneered, his tongue thick with liquor. "You got grit, old man. But she's mine. You can't change blood." "Blood ain't worth a damn if it don't know mercy," Samuel replied. For a long moment, nothing but the wind moved between them. Then Johnson spat again, muttered a curse, and stumbled back toward the road, his words thrown over his shoulder like knives. "You'll see me again. Count on it." Samuel watched him go until the dust swallowed him, then turned back toward the cabin. But Lila was already there in the doorway, her hands gripping the frame, her face pale as the sky before a storm. "It was him," she whispered, her voice trembling. "My pa." Samuel nodded once, his expression hardening into something that wasn't fear but resolve. "I know." She swallowed, her eyes wide and wet. "He'll come back." Samuel looked past her toward the horizon, where the man had disappeared, and the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint clink of a bottle and a promise of trouble. "Then we'll be ready," he said. But deep down he knew readiness didn't stop ghosts, and hers was walking on two legs, meaner than ever, headed straight for them. The days that followed carried a quiet tension beneath their calm, like thunder murmuring far off in the hills, but Samuel didn't let it show. He rose before dawn, as he always had, working the cattle, fixing the barn roof, mending what the wind and time had taken, yet his eyes kept drifting toward the fence line, half expecting to see a shadow stumble back out of the horizon. Lila noticed, though she didn't speak of it. She worked harder instead, as if effort itself could keep the past away. Still, Samuel knew fear when he saw it, even when it wore a brave face, and one evening after the chores were done, he led her out to the open field with the old bay mare saddled and waiting. "You ever ridden before?" he asked, handing her the reins. She shook her head, brow furrowed. "Then it's time you learned, just in case." Her mouth opened like she might argue, but the words never came. She climbed into the saddle, awkward at first, her boots slipping against the stirrups, and Samuel steadied her with a hand at her back. "Easy now," he said softly, the tone of a man teaching patience to a wild thing. "Ain't about strength. It's about trust, between you and the animal." The mare shifted beneath her, sensing her hesitation. "Let her know you're not scared," Samuel said, walking alongside as she took the first steps, his rough hand resting lightly on the bridle. She feels it same as folks do. For a while, the only sound was the creak of leather and the rhythmic thud of hooves against dry earth. Then Lila tried to turn, too quick, and the mare snorted, jolting sideways. She gasped, clutching the horn, and for a heartbeat Samuel's heart stopped, but she caught herself, swaying wildly before righting her balance. The sight must have struck her funny, because suddenly she laughed a real laugh, bright and unguarded, the kind that cracked through the silence like sunlight after rain. Samuel couldn't help it. He chuckled too, shaking his head. "You got spirit, I'll give you that," he said. "Thought you'd be crying by now." "Maybe later," she teased, still smiling, and the sound of it lingered long after they led the mare back to the barn. That night, they sat by the fire, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and beans simmering on the stove. Lila sat cross-legged on the floor, the rifle Samuel had set beside her gleaming in the lamplight. "You really think he'll come back?" she asked after a long silence. Samuel's jaw tightened. "Men like him don't quit till the bottle runs dry or their hate does. We'll be ready for either." She nodded, tracing the grain of the floorboards with her finger. After a moment she spoke again, quieter now. "When I was little, I used to dream about a man who wouldn't raise his voice, one who didn't use his hands to make me small." Samuel looked at her then, and something old and tender flickered behind his tired eyes. He turned back to the fire, poking at it with a stick, his voice low. "Guess we both dreamed wrong for too long," he said. The flames danced between them, soft and gold, their shadows moving like two people learning, at last, how to live without fear. Outside, the wind swept through the valley, and though neither said it, both felt the strange, unspoken bond settling between them, fragile as a promise, but real. The night was heavy with the kind of silence that only comes before violence, the air thick and unmoving, moonlight spilling silver over the corral where the horses shifted nervously in their pens. Samuel had been dreaming not of the past for once, but of the steady rhythm of hooves and laughter, when the sudden snort and crash of a spooked mare tore him awake. He sat up fast, the old instinct snapping through him before thought could catch up. The air inside the cabin felt wrong, too still, too quiet, save for the faint creak of wood outside and the quick, muffled sound of men moving where no men should be. In the same motion, he grabbed his rifle from beside the door, thumbed the hammer back, and stepped out onto the porch. The cold bit through his shirt, but he didn't feel it. His eyes swept the dark, and their movement, shadows cutting across the corral, 3 of them. One held a lantern low, trying to hide the light. Another tugged at a halter rope, whispering harshly, "Quiet, damn you." And then he saw the third man, broad shoulders, crooked hat, a familiar stagger in his step even from 50 paces away. Johnson, Lila's father. Drunk, mean, and worse, determined. "You sold your soul for liquor," Samuel muttered under his breath. "Now you come to collect what ain't yours." He raised the rifle, the metal cold against his cheek. The first shot split the night wide open, a sharp crack that echoed off the hills. The man with the lantern dropped where he stood, light tumbling to the dirt, its flame licking up toward the sky. The horses reared, shrieking, kicking at the rails. The second man bolted for the tree line, cursing, his shadow vanishing into the black. But Johnson didn't run. He turned, wild-eyed, a glint of steel catching the moonlight as he drew a knife from his belt. "You think you can take what's mine, Grady?" he roared, voice slurred but thick with rage. "You stole my girl." He charged, stumbling but fast, the knife flashing. Samuel fired again, but the shot went wide, the sound deafening at such close range. Before he could chamber another round, Johnson was on him, the 2 of them crashing into the dirt with a grunt and a spray of gravel. The knife slashed across Samuel's arm, burning hot. But he caught Johnson's wrist before the next blow could land, twisting hard until the bone cracked and the blade fell away. "She ain't yours," Samuel growled, his voice low, raw with fury. "Not by blood, not by right." Johnson's face twisted into something monstrous, the stink of whiskey and hate between them as he spat. "You think you're better? You're just another bastard playing hero." The words barely left his mouth before Samuel drove his fist into his jaw. Once, twice, the sound of knuckles meeting flesh echoing through the night like hammer strikes. Johnson went limp, collapsing against the dirt, his breath ragged, the knife gleaming inches from his hand. Samuel staggered to his feet, chest heaving, rifle clutched tight in his bleeding arm. Behind him, the cabin door burst open, and Lila stood framed in the lantern light, eyes wide with terror and disbelief. "Pa?" she whispered, voice breaking. Her father stirred, groaning, blood pooling dark beneath his chin. "Stay inside," Samuel barked, his voice rough but steady, never looking back at her. The horses stamped and cried, the smell of gunpowder hanging thick in the air, and for a moment it felt as though the whole world was holding its breath. Johnson tried to lift his head, his words slurred and broken. "She's mine," he rasped. Samuel stared down at him, the rifle barrel trembling ever so slightly. "Not anymore," he said. The wind rose then, carrying the echo of his words out into the dark, where no law reached only justice, harsh and lonely as the land itself. The moment froze in a heartbeat, the knife flashing under the moon, Samuel staggering back, blood dark on his sleeve, and then everything moved at once. Lila saw her father's shadow rising over Samuel, the blade catching the light like a sliver of cold fire, and before she could think, before fear could turn to reason, she ran. Her bare feet hit the porch boards hard, the revolver heavy and foreign in her trembling hands. The lessons Samuel had drilled into her came rushing back in fragments: how to steady her breath, how to hold firm, how not to flinch when it mattered most, but none of it seemed real now. Not with that face staring back at her, the face that had haunted every nightmare she'd ever had. "Pa, stop," she cried, voice shaking, but he didn't hear her, or maybe he did and didn't care. The whiskey and hate had swallowed the man he once was, leaving only a wild thing, mean and desperate. He lunged again, the knife arcing down toward Samuel's chest, and Lila screamed. The sound split the night, followed by another sharp, thunderous, final. The revolver kicked hard against her palms, smoke curling from the barrel as her father jerked backward, surprise flickering across his face before he fell. Hard and still, the blade slipping from his fingers. For a long second, all she could hear was the ringing in her ears and the frantic thud of her own heart. The smell of gunpowder filled the air, sharp and bitter, mingling with the dust and blood. Samuel was on his knees beside the body, his eyes wide, not with fear but something deeper, sorrow, maybe, or understanding. "Lila," he began, but she was already shaking her head, the gun slipping from her grip as she stumbled forward. "I didn't—" Her breath hitched, and the words broke apart, carried off by the wind. "I didn't want to." She fell against him then, her small frame racked with sobs, hands clutching at his shirt like she could tear the moment from reality and make it unhappen. Samuel caught her, pulling her close, the strength in his arms steadying the chaos that swirled around them. "It's over," he murmured, his voice rough but soft, the kind of voice that could have belonged to a father himself once. "You did what you had to." She shook her head, choking on the tears, but he only held her tighter, his blood mixing with hers, the night closing around them like a curtain. The echo of the shot drifted through the valley, bouncing off the hills until it faded into silence, a silence so deep it felt like the land itself was mourning. The horses had gone quiet, the air heavy with smoke and regret. Samuel looked down at the man lying in the dirt, the one who'd called himself her blood, and felt no triumph, only a grim kind of mercy. He reached out, closing the dead man's eyes with a calloused hand, then turned back to Lila, brushing the hair from her face. "Listen to me," he said quietly. "You didn't kill what was good in him. That part was gone long before tonight. You just stopped what was left." Her sobs quieted then, replaced by the shallow, broken rhythm of exhaustion. Samuel stood, lifting her gently in his arms, her head resting against his shoulder. Behind them, the moon climbed higher, pale and cold, shining down on the field where a father's cruelty had finally met its end, and a girl, trembling and free, had taken her first step into a life that might finally be her own. The dawn came gray and heavy, the kind of morning that felt too still for words, and Samuel Grady rose before the sun to dig a grave at the edge of the property, where the land sloped gently toward the creek and the earth was soft enough to yield. Each shovelful of dirt thudded against the still air, marking time in slow, heavy rhythm, a sound both penance and promise. The night's chaos had burned itself out, leaving behind only silence, smoke, and the strange calm that follows the storm of men's cruelty. Lila hadn't slept. Samuel knew that by the hollow look in her eyes, by the way her hands trembled when she brought him water but never drank any herself. She didn't cry anymore, the tears had run dry somewhere between the shot and the sunrise, but grief hung around her like fog, quiet and cold. When the hole was finally dug, Samuel stood a long while, staring down at the rough shape in the ground, at the body wrapped in an old tarp that had once covered hay. No words came to him, not prayers, not forgiveness, just a kind of weary understanding that some men die long before their bodies give out, and what goes into the earth is only what's left. Lila came walking from the cabin, her bare feet dark with dust, holding a single wildflower she must have plucked from the field by the creek. The wind tugged at her hair, loose and unkempt, but her face was steady, set in that quiet strength he'd come to recognize. She stopped beside him, looking down at the grave, her fingers tracing the edges of the flower's stem. "He gave me life," she said softly, the words nearly carried away by the breeze. "But you gave me a reason to live it." Samuel swallowed hard, his throat tightening as he watched her kneel and place the wildflower atop the mound of earth. The petals fluttered in the wind, bright and fragile against the dark soil, a small, stubborn thing daring to exist where nothing good had before. He took off his hat then, holding it to his chest, his eyes on the horizon rather than the grave, because looking down felt too much like judgment, and this wasn't a day for that. "Ain't no easy kind of peace," he said finally, his voice rough from too many unspoken things. "But maybe it's the only kind worth having." Lila stood slowly, her shoulders squared, the weight of the past settling somewhere deeper, somewhere she could carry it without breaking. When she looked at him, there was no blame, no need for comfort, only that quiet, tired gratitude that didn't need explaining. Samuel reached out, his calloused hand resting gently over hers, the gesture simple but sure. "You don't owe him forgiveness," he said, meeting her eyes. "The living get to choose who they belong to." She nodded, her lower lip trembling but her voice steady. "Then I choose here." The words hung between them, soft as a prayer, as the first light of morning broke over the hills, washing the grave in gold. Samuel squeezed her hand once, firm and wordless, before setting his hat back on his head. Together they turned toward the cabin, toward the smell of coffee and smoke and a life that might finally grow in the shadow of all that had died. Behind them, the wind moved through the tall grass, carrying away the last trace of last night's blood and sorrow, leaving only the wildflower swaying gently in the dawn. The weeks that followed settled over the ranch like a slow and tender healing, the kind that didn't announce itself but crept in quietly through soft mornings and long, golden evenings where the land breathed easy again. The echoes of that terrible night still lingered in the corners of Samuel's mind, but each day seemed to push them farther away, replaced by the rhythm of chores, the creak of saddle leather, and the small, steady sounds of life returning to what had once been an empty home. Lila had taken to singing while she worked, not the broken hums she'd once offered under her breath, but full songs now, bright and unashamed, the kind that floated through the yard and carried across the pasture. Sometimes it was a hymn, sometimes just something she made up as she went along, but whatever the tune, Samuel always found himself listening. Her voice wove through the days like sunlight through dust, filling spaces he hadn't realized were hollow. In the mornings, she'd scatter feed for the hens, her laughter echoing as they clucked and chased each other through the yard. In the afternoons, she'd patch fences beside him, talking more than anyone he'd ever known about the color of clouds, the shape of dreams, the future she didn't quite believe in yet but wanted to. Samuel, for his part, spoke little, but his silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of grief, nor the kind that built walls between him and the world. It was gentler now, a quiet shaped by contentment, by trust. He caught himself watching her sometimes, not with pity, not even with protectiveness anymore, but with a deep, wordless pride at how she had turned sorrow into strength. The ranch itself seemed to follow suit. Grass grew greener, the animals steadier, even the wind softer when it moved through the tall grass at dusk. That evening, as the sun sank behind the distant hills and painted the sky in bands of fire and rose, Samuel sat on the porch mending a bridle while Lila knelt by the coop, scattering the last handful of grain. She was barefoot, her dress dusted with feathers and sunlight, and as she straightened, She began to hum again, a tune so light it almost sounded like laughter turned to music. When she looked up and saw him watching, she grinned, shading her eyes from the sundae. "You don't talk much, Mr. Grady," she called, teasing but warm. Samuel huffed a quiet laugh, the sound rumbling low in his chest as he tied off the last knot. "You do enough for the both of us," he said, the corners of his mouth lifting into a smile that surprised even him. She laughed softly, turning back to the hens, and the sound settled over the land like a benediction. For a long while they stayed like that, two souls bound not by blood or promise, but by something quieter and truer, something built in the spaces between loss and laughter. The wind carried her song out over the prairie, mingling with the lowing of cattle and the sigh of the grass, and Samuel found himself thinking that maybe this was what peace sounded like. Not silence, but a voice filling the air, a melody fragile and fierce, reminding the world that even after all it takes, life still finds a way to sing. When the last light faded and the stars came out one by one, he leaned back in his chair, the weight of years easing from his shoulders, and thought, with a small, steady certainty, that for the first time in a long while, the world felt right.